I think of it as like the Pentagram of Needs, like this interlinked series of things that all feed one another. Because, yeah, if your house is on fire, you're not going to do a good job of forecasting. But if you're not doing a good job of forecasting, you're more likely to have your house on fire. So it's kind of like an interconnected whole in terms of how we try to find our way through a pretty chaotic world with the tools of divination and magic and spirit guidance and practical things, so many practical things, the grown-upping stuff, that gives us an opportunity to get through this to a crazy time and to build something better.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
My guest today is Ivy Bromius of Circle Thrice. Ivy and I have known each other for a number of years now, and she has become both a friend and a returning friend of the show. Her work brings together a wonderfully unusual and useful combination of skills in practical enchantment, professional project management, and forecasting through tarot and other forms of divination. In our conversation today, we talk a lot about the nature of risk, how poorly we human beings tend to be at assessing it and preparing for it, and also the nature of how divination plays into that. We also talk about how practical magic and divination, as well as planning in general, can help us become more resilient and more sovereign in our choices. Before we get started, a few quick announcements. For my listeners in and around London, I will be teaching a workshop at the historic Atlantis Bookshop on July 27th. And for those in the US, I'll be teaching at Templefest this September. A number of guests on the show will also be at Templefest this year. Ticket sales for that will close in late July, so if you are planning to attend, don't wait too long. You will find all the information for those events in the show notes. I also want to say how grateful I am for all the support you've given The Diviner's Path, my new book, so far. If you've read and enjoyed the book, even a brief, honest review posted where you purchased it or shared on social media can really make a difference in helping other people find it. If you post anything on social media about it, be sure to tag me at Coffee and Divination. And now, here's my conversation with Ivy Bromius.
So it is my pleasure to welcome back to the show, I think someone that qualifies now as friend of the show, Ivy Bromius, and it is a delight to have you here. So thank you so much for your time once again.
Thank you. It's amazing to be back with you.
So for those who may not have heard your previous interviews on this show, can you just kind of do a little brief intro of yourself and what you do over at Circle Thrice, your website?
So I have a weird kind of collection of obsessions. Project management, and I've been a project manager professionally for like 20 years. Practical enchantment, I've been doing that like twice as long, and informed forecasting through tarot, but all kinds of forecasting. And those three things come together into Circle Thrice. So it's like a Venn diagram overlap of project planning, practical astro magic, and forecasting. And I know that's strange, but it works really well together.
Absolutely. And so when you do those types of workings, you have I will just caveat this by saying, of course, I am a member of her offerings and do recommend them highly. So we will go with that from the very beginning. But just to state this more plainly, you have offerings that you offer in terms of one-on-one things with coaching clients, but you also have group offerings. And I'm just curious if you could just tell us more about like what is that balance in terms of how you put those different pieces together into your website.
Absolutely. So I have, as you know, I have like a membership that comes with a magical planner that's like astro timing magic for every day, and that's kind of like the basics. And then I have some coursework. But where my heart is really at is kind of my consulting work. And what I think of as my mission is basically helping magical people build the next world, that our hearts know is possible, right? The better world that we know we need to be working on. And yeah, I do have individual clients and even individual business consulting that I do. But one of the things that I've been doing lately that is just I'm really loving is kind of these small group containers, which is kind of like it's a handful of us all working together. And it's so beautiful because we have like a theme for the group, either starting a business or mitigating risk or whatever it is, and we all work together. It's beautiful for not only accountability, right? For me too, right? We all show up every week, we all do the work, but also just for uplifting one another with intentions and enchantments and divination swaps. And so they become like these little circles that where we're all working together kind of to help each other with our goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And what has been beautiful that you have come on this show a few times to talk about various free offerings. So in addition to what you do there, you have free offerings, some of which are on some very serious topics. One was, of course, the Cancer Grimoire that you put together based on your experiences. And you've also had something which many people may have encountered, which is risky business, which is you have some offerings that are about risk management and sort of magical project management. And now you are kind of diving more into that. So this is a podcast about divination. And I feel like one of the most obvious places to start with this conversation is that how do you view the interaction between the idea of risk and the idea of divining and looking forwards into that future?
One of the reasons I was so excited to come back on the show and talk about this is because I have been focused very much. It's always been an obsession of mine. Like I had the Risky Business book, it became a course, it became like a free mini workshop for the course. It's like a whole thing. It's tied deeply to divination and forecasting because risk is temporally in the future, right? A risk is something traditionally bad that could happen, but might not happen. And so much of enchantment is about building these beautiful futures, but there's always this sense of risk. Do I do option A or B? What do I need to be concerned about? What do I need to know more about? And so for me, um, I think of it as just magical risk mitigation. So it's risk mitigation in a very boring corporate sounding way, but with magic, with divination. And divination is so critical for that because forewarned is forearmed, right? The more you can get a sense of what you should be doing, what your right path is, what your heart is calling you toward, what the gods are calling you toward, the more of that information you can collect, the better able you are to chart like a safe and beneficial course through any rocky waters. And we've got a lot of rocky waters out there in the world right now.
One of the other things that comes up is how people deal emotionally with the concept of risk, which I do believe that when we look to things like tools of divination, whatever we're talking about, and we're immediately going to delve into territories where people are facing fears and facing anxieties, or, I don't want to say baggage, but like our memories from the past of how things have happened when they've been unexpected. So what do you think of as a way of thinking about healthy amounts of risk, or helping people manage their emotions around risk?
Yeah, this is so important because so much of this kind of stuff out in the world is very, everything is terrifying, freak out. Also, buy my thing. Great. That's nice of you. Thanks. The truth is that mitigating risk is empowering. Considering things that could go wrong and then working around that either to make them go right or to actually avoid them entirely or benefit from them going wrong, which is kind of the elite level of this, that's empowering. That's really powerful. It's a core aspect of how I approach this topic because it can feel so scary. to be considering risk. Nobody wants to think about bad things happening, in part because we all have this sort of like magical view that, like, well, if I think about a bad thing, that might happen. Except not really, right? I mean, yeah, you shouldn't go around being miserable all the time. Being positive and optimistic is a good thing, but thinking about something bad that can happen, yeah, dwelling upon it endlessly, that makes bad magic. But thinking about something bad that can happen and then putting measures in place to keep it away or make it less harmful or dodge it entirely, that's good magic. So, first of all, those of us who have that sort of enchanted magical worldview need to get past this idea that if I think about it, it's going to happen. No, that's disempowering. And then once you start considering, uh, yourself as a temporal being with possible futures and this sense of moving through time, or even more so, pulling the correct futures to you, again, you end up in a place where you feel more sovereign and in control of things. And that doesn't mean nothing bad is ever going to happen, but it feels better. You end up with less fear.
And I know that there's a lot we could say on this topic, but there's a sort of sometimes negative side to the whole, like, if you think it, it will happen. You can make your dreams come true. Where then people will get into the idea of, well, if I've thought about the bad things, I might make them happen. I've had people say the same thing to me about not wanting to do divination at times because they're afraid of sort of locking in a bad omen if they do the divination on it, as if by then pulling that card, you have collapsed reality into that card occurring, which I think, to my mind as a diviner, I think of that as a misunderstanding of the interlocking of fate being continuously in motion. It's not a thing that simply collapses into being just from the pull of a card, any more than looking at a thing has necessarily meant that now the worst is going to happen. But what do you think on that?
No, no, totally. And I think this particular misperception of how magic works in the world, it's not uncommon. And I think it's really can be really harmful because it can cause stuff like victim blaming, right? So I had cancer and I wrote a book about my experiences doing magic to get through my cancer treatment. There are emotional and initiatory reasons that somebody might go through a serious health diagnosis. That doesn't mean that I just wasn't positive enough and that it's my fault that I got cancer, right? Like that's a really toxic sort of view. And it's the same here. If our thoughts were so powerful, then I would already be on a private island. And I'm not, right? We are living in a world with lots of complex moving parts. We have our charts and our stars and our relationships and our baggage, and all that goes together. And if we understood all of it, we wouldn't be here incarnate, living it, right? Part of the process of living it is not knowing some things, experiencing things we might not like. But the truth is that thinking about a bad thing doesn't manifest that. Just like thinking about a good thing doesn't manifest that either. It's what you do and what you intend, right? Your energy, your magic, your actions that help transform your life and your future.
Which then becomes a sort of habit of spiritual action and thought that then entrains and changes that, which is not the pull of one card or stray thoughts about, analytically analyzing what the pros and cons of a situation are.
In fact, it's not ironic that if there's a risk in your life that you know of, and you don't do anything about it, you just ignore it, that actually makes it more likely to happen because you're just ignoring it and not dealing with it, right? And if it's in the back of your mind making you worried and anxious, that is the kind of dwelling on the negative that can cause maladaptive behaviors that then are self-fulfilling prophecies. So when you bring it into the light, like a shadow, like shadow work, and say, okay, here's the thing. This is potentially a risk. What do I do about this? And then you decide that you can or can't do anything, and then you let it move past you and you let it go.
So there's we each have tendencies, and I feel like this is in different areas of our lives. We each kind of have these different practices to different degrees. Where there might be areas of our lives where we tend to overestimate risks, and other areas where we tend to just completely ignore them, either avoid them or just think that they won't happen. Do you have ways? I'm sure you do, considering that you have courses and books on this, but it's a leading question for a reason. How do you think that, how do you think with helping people address areas where they have either been overestimating the amount of risk or completely going into avoidance mode and if I don't look at it, it doesn't exist?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that people, and I include myself here in people, are historically really bad at risk. And I think it's because we evolved to sort of be like, there's a tiger in the bush, and the bush is, and the tiger's going to eat me. Like at a very like a this, we did not evolve to deal with like systemic risk and anxiety, which is what the modern world gives us. Complex, interrelated risk models with a lot of chronic anxiety to go with them. We're just not good at that. And so, yeah, one of the key results of not having a sense of kind of some good practices around this is that you go crazy worrying about something that's unlikely to happen, or that if it happened, you can't do anything about it. Like, please don't spend time worrying about a meteor hitting us because, yeah, but so what you're going to do about that, right? So we tend to like overestimate risks, and then we avoid doing things that would make our lives so much better because they feel really risky. What if I left my shitty job? That's hugely scary. And yet every day you hop into this 1,000-pound hunk of steel and whip yourself down the freeway at 65 miles per hour, which for the vast majority of us is the most risky activity statistically that we do every single day without a second thought on our phones while doing our hair in the mirror, right? Like we don't take it at all seriously. And I'm not saying you should be afraid of driving. I'm kind of saying the reverse, right? That you have to assess these in a way that makes sense. And yeah, yeah, a whole kind of course and consulting stuff on this because there are so many tools you can use for really understanding whether something's risky or not. One of the fun tools that I like to take people through is that if there's something that feels really scary or nervous making, you can actually do this really nice exercise where you write down the absolute worst possible thing that could happen. And then you write down the very, very best thing that can happen. And then you sort of like just plug a bunch of like mid-range options in between. And you can easily see when you put it on paper like that, whether it's a problem or not. So a great example of this is, let's say that you want to write a book. I know you have a book coming out. I'm really excited for you. And you want to write a book, but it feels really scary. And that's something a lot of people feel really nervous about, like putting themselves out there and writing. Well, the best thing that can happen is you sell 8 gajillion copies and you're more popular than the Bible. It's not likely, but it is the absolute best result. The worst result is what? Your family and friends all disown you and you die alone in a ditch? That's also not super likely, right? The mid-range, the most likely options are you sell some copies and now you're a writer. Maybe you write another book, right? Like when you look at it that way, you're like, I should probably not be scared of this. Or you can see that there are risks, like solo travel around the world. You could look at that and go, there are some honest to goodness risks here. But if I do these basic things, I can mitigate those risks. And then, yeah, and those are just, that's like a totally non-magical technique. I also have a ton of magic against fear, divination techniques, particularly to identify the things you really should be worried about and whatnot. And just enchantments and prayers and sigil statements around aligning yourself correctly with risk.
I think, yeah, that's all extremely clear, and the entire the entire spectrum of that range, I do very much enjoy, and I have had to do to myself many times that exercise of, okay, what is the worst that could happen if you open this like it'll be over something really silly. Like, I don't want to read this email from this person because what if they said no or said something mean to me? And I'm like, let's look at the worst that could happen. Really not that bad. And it's only when you go to the worst that you see how silly the worst is, unlikely to happen, and then you can kind of go from there, and you've sort of defanged the demon that is usually extremely impractical. However, I do want to say that with divination, I'm sure you have found the same, that sometimes there can be sort of this, I don't know whether it's like Protestantism. I don't want to just blame Protestant, ethics, but there's an almost sometimes a desire to push too hard on the other side, to say, for example, I've had people who have pushed themselves by asking questions that are maybe a little bit too emotionally charged for themselves, and they actually will almost push themselves into deeper waters than they're actually emotionally ready to handle. And I'm wondering if with risk, like you've seen people where they're like, well, I'll just rip the Band-Aid off and I'm just going to get rid of all my fears. And you could go too far with that, just even from not necessarily from a danger perspective, but from an emotional perspective.
I think that's such a valuable comment, because we could joke about the whole, you wrote a book and now your friends leave you to die in the ditch, haha. But fear is never funny to the person who's experiencing it. And I know that from my own fears, because I have my own, and my conscious mind knows that they're not super rational. It's not as much of a risk as you think, but they're still really scary and they're uncomfortable. This is deep emotional work, and there can be a lot here to unpack. For me, my approach is much more, first of all, it's a process, ongoing, cyclical. You don't just sit down one day, make a list of everything bad that could happen, buy some insurance and move on, right? It's a process that you kind of circle into. And that by choosing what to do with something that feels risky, you're taking the power. You can choose to ignore a risk. And in fact, sometimes that's the best possible thing to do, right? You can choose to dip your toe in and see how it feels. Because, yeah, so this is interesting because my risk course has, well, this whole chunk at the front called Be Not Afraid, right? Like, this is like the fear stuff. And then there's a whole section that's about risk mitigation of bad things that could actually happen that you don't want to happen, right? So there's, all the techniques, all the magic. But in between, there's this section called Choices and Chances. And that's the area we're in here now. Because you don't just rip off the Band-Aid and stop being afraid of stuff. Look, risk can feel scary and not be scary, but risk can actually be bad. You don't necessarily you shouldn't be afraid of a house fire, but having a fire extinguisher and fire insurance and smoke alarms, good risk mitigation, right? Now you've done practical things that keep you from having to worry so much about this one thing. You still don't want things to be on fire. I love that I have a candle over my shoulder while we're having this conversation.
Yes, for those just listening in on the audio version, yes, there is.
Yeah, right. Here I am
burning in the background, just to
right here, making fire, right? But the truth is that every choice you make has a risk attached, and every risk you face has a decision to make. And so those are a loop. You just can't avoid all risk or never be afraid, because life is just full of all kinds of things happening, good and bad, and your very decision-making process can expose you to risk. So making good choices and taking smart chances, right? There's always someone who's not afraid, who like just fell off a building or got eaten by a crocodile through some sort of pretty silly hijinks. And maybe a little fear isn't a terrible thing, right? Like maybe there's a point at which you're like, this is actually something I don't want. How do I avoid it?
Do not pose bear cubs if you see them in the wild for a better
Exactly.
Don't do that. But going in a more serious reference, then there is what you're talking about is the term of basically being anti-fragile, like having practices that allow you to make safer choices, shall we say, while still allowing risk into a healthy portion of your life. Could you maybe define like anti-fragility or how that plays into this?
Yeah, so the concept of anti-fragile comes from this series of books by this guy named Taleb, who is a really good writer. Turns out he's kind of a jerk online, but his ideas are still really interesting. And I take them basically, I have jailbroken them for like an enchanted magical worldview, which he does not have. So you have to keep in mind that part of this is ideas that he is writing about, and then part of it is my weird magical overlay. Because he wrote about this concept of the black swan, right? Which is a thing that can happen, and Bertrand Russell wrote about it before him. This thing that can happen that nobody expects, that is really out of this world, crazy bad, right? Like that unexpectedly happened and was nobody could have seen it coming. Well, obviously, I have a divination for that, right? Like I have this concept of divining. So it's not a black swan anymore if you know it's coming. But the concept of anti-fragile comes from this idea that there's this sort of view that things can either be stable or robust, and that those are on like a continuum. But there's a sort of an orthogonal like axis here, which is, are you fragile or are you anti-fragile? And if you're anti-fragile, it just means that when there's chaos and disorder, you get stronger. And it's a concept that exists in nature, like bones grow back stronger when they're broken. Natural systems, like an ecosystem, will often come back, like parts of it will come back stronger due to disruption. Right? You kill all the wolves in Yellowstone. Well, the deers are anti-fragile to that, and they just go nuts, right? All of those balanced and unbalancing systems, there are things that get stronger when there's disorder. And there are tools and magical techniques you can use to become more personally anti-fragile. And then it's not so much that I must avoid all risk. Wouldn't that be nice? That's impossible. It's more that if you're in a time and a place where there's lots of chaos and disorder, hot tip, you are, I am, everybody in the Western world is right now, because it just is, then having those things in place where you can be flexible and leverage options when things are wild and crazy, or even benefit. My favorite example of this is a diviner's example, which is that one of the weird results of COVID lockdowns was that every single astrologer I knew and every single astrologer I heard of was suddenly booked solid for a year. Because everyone was like, what the heck? I need information. Now, it's not unethical to be an astrologer and helping people with these important life changes and questions and serious situations, but they're definitely benefiting from chaos. Divination benefits from chaos because it likes dirty laundry and it likes bad news. So it's an anti-fragile practice to divine.
The way that I would kind of conceive of it is that when situations, as you mentioned, we throw ourselves down the highways at 65 miles an hour in extremely, risky situations that we've just all decided as a culture, we take those risks and we accept them and we don't think about them so much. Doesn't mean we don't think about them at all. Of course, we're still considerate of like how dangerous that is, but it isn't a thing that we think about a lot. And then there are situations in life or in the world situation that causes those risks to be more front of mind, in which case we'll be more aware of the fact that we might need to talk to an astrologer near you, or think about the plans and the ways that we're organizing our lives in a different way because of that. So what would you say is a sign, if you had to give a sort of example, or what is something that would lead you to believe that someone's magical practices or their life, what would be an example of like a more fragile state that you would be like, oh, that's an example of something that's a little bit more fragile and you would want to do something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, things that are inherently unfragile are lack of options. So options are anti-fragile, like you have choices, options. So things that restrict your options are make for more fragile situations. So debt would be a really obvious one, right? And that's a one that's probably not a huge surprise to everyone, right? But debt is in that category. Being locked into things is in that category. In a high chaos situation, that might not be the time to start an extremely expensive 4-year degree program in a field that is being rapidly overtaken by creepy technological advances, right? You're locked in, you're spending a lot. Anything, and then the reverse of that, things that are signs of a more resilient, more anti-fragile situation are people who try to keep their options open, who fail fast and pivot fast. They try stuff without a huge commitment to see if it works for them. And that includes magical techniques. And then they pivot. If that doesn't work, they adjust course until they click and they get into the state where it's working for them. So yeah, those are the types of things that you can watch out for. In fact, in the course, I have this sort of like a quiz on it. Like, okay, so in your family, do you get all your news sources from one place or multiple places? Like narrow information streams are more fragile than wider information intake. And you can think of that as I only watch the one gross news channel, but you can also think of it as I read widely. I listen to a lot of different voices and even people who I might not agree with, but I still listen because I'm getting information. Or I read, like I divine and forecast through a lot of different methods.
Yeah, so that is like a plurality of sources, and information sources is a part of that anti-fragile thing. And
Yeah.
all of that also implies a certain amount of time spent um, investigating and being open to new sources of information. And like you mentioned, pivoting fast, which means that you do have to be not avoiding looking at things, because you can't make decisions to pivot fast if you're just avoiding looking at it to begin with. So
Don't pivot past with your eyes closed. You'll run into the wall is kind of the metaphor. Yeah. Yeah. Also, in a chaotic environment, you want to do those things. You want to be flexible and agile and pivot fast, but you have to do it within some kind of structure or you will just be chaotic too. And so one of the things that I've really been working on is a way to align some of those planning structures at different levels to various astrological phenomena. So like I have sort of this concept that you really should have a lunar cycle that sort of says in the next month, because the month is associated with the moon, what are kind of the tasks I want to accomplish that go toward my larger goals, the larger goals being more associated maybe with the sun for your annual kind of thing. And this is sort of something I've been working on. But regardless, the most chaos seems to happen when you ignore trouble. It's like that stitch in time thing, right? You ignore things and then they get worse. And now you don't have a risk, you have an issue or a crisis. So if a risk is something bad might happen, an issue is, and now it's happening, and a crisis is, and it's been happening and everything is falling apart. And so that's an important component of this too, because it's all nice to say, do a ton of work to avoid risk in your future. And you're like, yeah, the future's now. Shit's on fire. What do I do? So a big part of what I try to do is to work people through like a magical triage system for dealing with current crises. Because, and we've all been there, right? Like, you're like, your advice is so nice, but also everything is already falling apart. So what do I do there? So that's part of it as well, as you have to like get things sort of back under control in the present in order to look clear-eyed at the future.
there's like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs of like, first I need the house to not be on fire in order for me to sit and meditate in it about future goals. But that is having a structure for that. That is the thing that you absolutely go into and provide, because there's ways that the long-term planning can be turned into the very short term if we need it right in the present moment.
Yeah, we have that flexibility. Also, it's interesting that you bring up Maslow's hierarchy of needs because I actually have a lesson on this in my thing, which talks about how the hierarchy of needs is kind of bogus
Oh,
in
I
that
know, but it's the what it is.
I know, but it's really more this like I think of it as like the pentagram of needs, like this interlinked series of things that all feed one another. Because yeah, if your house is on fire, you're not going to do a good job of forecasting. But if you're not doing a good job of forecasting, you're more likely to have your house on fire. So it's kind of like an interconnected whole in terms of how we try to find our way through a pretty chaotic world with the tools of divination and magic and spirit guidance and practical things, so many practical things, the grown-upping stuff, that gives us an opportunity to get through this to a crazy time and to build something better. And I have to say, I'm feeling really pulled toward this work now because I think it's desperately, desperately needed.
Yes, I could not agree more. And I think that ties into another thing that I wanted to talk about, which was that you and I both, well, for me with divination, I am usually encouraging people to have sort of a buddy system in place because I feel like with divination, especially, can be a lot easier. Of course, you can do it completely by yourself, and that's great. And I did for many years when I didn't know anybody who was also doing it. But it is so much easier when you have another person who is respectful and interested that you can bounce things off of. And then, of course, if it's more than a buddy system and it's a whole community, that is a really important thing. And you have already embedded it into the systems that you are putting into place. Why do you think that these types of discussions around divination and risk or, project planning, why do you include so much community element with it?
Yeah, we all have a perspective. We'd like to think it's a really wide. We're open-minded, we have a wide perspective, but truthfully, our perspective is narrow just based on our experiences and our emotions and our life. And it makes it really hard to divine, particularly on very emotionally charged topics, personal topics, makes it really hard to do your own divination. And if you've got nobody else, you do it anyway. But the idea of having other people you can go to is really critical. I have people that I go to for stuff that I can't read effectively for myself. And I've been doing this since I was a teenager, which was a long time ago. So yeah, I think it's super valuable. I also think though, beyond just, oh, there's a couple of tarot readers and we all trade readings for one another. When it comes to risk mitigation, so much of that is thinking outside the box, getting past your own kind of perceptive and perceptual limitations around what's possible and what you can do and what's real and what's like, how you can be free to make choices. Some of that's not clear to us, but it's really clear to other people. And the reverse, right? Like none of us are really good at seeing our own shit. So when you work together in a group, it uplifts everybody in the group because you can brainstorm solutions. You can have like that wisdom of the crowds kind of vibe where I might not know something I need to know, but somebody else in the group does. And I've seen that work so almost miraculously when I work with these small groups where this person needs a thing and this other person has either the exact thing, but the exact information, the exact ability, and it's so much more empowering to do it in a group. The trick is that it doesn't happen that way on social media, right? It has to be a safe, trusted environment, and that's the difference. That's why it's great that we can all go online and find magical weirdos all over the world. My life would be poorer if I couldn't do that. But in order to do that kind of work, it's really good to have kind of a safe, trusted group of people to work with.
Absolutely. And that is, again, that's part of that same broadening. So if we are talking about not getting being more anti-fragile, being that having a stronger container and a stronger ability to deal with uncertainty, then that does also involve broadening perspectives, also of who we are even encountering, which means also getting outside of an echo chamber, which can be easier to encounter online because the lovely algorithms do love to present us with what they already know we agree with. But then when you encounter people who are in a container course like this or out in the wild in the world itself, then you are going to deal with situations that will cause you to be exposed to more new ideas and more perspectives, which will ultimately make you a stronger human being. I think you and I would both think.
Yeah, it also does two other really powerful things that I think we don't often think of. There is this statistic that rolls around that most networking job opportunities, if someone is networking for a job, come from their soft connections rather than their hard connections, right? So the idea is that your mom and sister or whatever know the exact same people in the exact same job environment you are likely to, but like your butcher's cousin may know a guy. So it's that kind of model. But that's not just jobs, that's everything. When you widen, like you create a wider network, then their networks like second order expand it. So there's that aspect that you get. And then there's also this feeling of when you work on something together, people say it's accountability, and there is that aspect to it, but it's not just holding each other accountable, it's trusting each other with our journeys. And it improves luck. So this is an interesting day to have this little conversation because one of the things I do for my membership is I put out a ritual every month that I timed to like the planner, and it was actually my goal in 2025, my goal to do more big magic, and this was my way of doing it. Speaking of accountability, right? I'm like, oh, I'll make it a thing for my membership, and now I have to do it. And the ritual for today is luck and fortune magic. And the ritual is weirdly based on a book called The Luck Factor. Uh, and it's a good book, but the point is that the idea is that research shows that being more open and knowing more people improves your luck. So by working together, you improve your luck, you widen your perspective, and you increase your network.
All of those pieces interlock together, and the more that you are paying attention to them and then giving them that energy, then they can also strengthen from the energy that is poured into that. So on a number of different levels.
And it makes good magic.
Oh yeah, yes. So when it comes to divining on some of these things, I've had one or two people talk to me about how they've gotten into almost paralysis of divination about decision making, where they feel like, well, if I just do one more reading, well, the readings came out positive, but I didn't include this one factor. So in a sense, like anxiety and divination will almost feed each other in a negative way, where then you can always find a reason why you need to wait for the stars that one more week, or wait until you do one more reading. How do you think about divination, and have you seen it play into sort of feeding anxiety as opposed to working your way towards good decisions?
If you are in an anxious state, you can put that anxiety in a number of different directions, right? So you could have a pint of Ben and Jerry's, right? Like you could be like, I am anxious and therefore will be eating crap today. And I'm guilty of this sometimes, right? Like everyone, I'm really wound up. If only I had some sugar, right? And divination can be just another tool for putting your anxiety into. Right. And I see what you mean about the kind of the negative feedback cycle. I would say that the solve for that is one, to do actual practical things that reduce your anxiety, right? In which case you'll be able to come to the cards or the runes or the stars or whatever you use in a calmer state, which will not only cause less anxiety, but get you better results. But also to know that you're the one who has to live your life and make your choices. no matter what the cards say. I think this is really powerful. I never ask the question, what should I do? Because I don't want to give away that power. I'll ask, what is the result if I do X? Or what should I know about doing a thing? Right? And I could use the cards that way, but I'm never asked what I should do because it can't tell me that. Only I can tell me that. And when you realize that the locus of control is with you and that you have the sovereignty and agency, then the cards are just informational tools rather than this like place to be nervous through.
Yeah, absolutely. So then it is that interplay between the divination being just a part of the larger processes that you already have in place. And that's how it doesn't spiral out of, doesn't take on an outsized influence in the place of the other pieces that should also be going.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that, I've been laying the cards for, oh God, like 4 decades now. Wow. And well, now I feel old, but I've been laying the cards for like 4 decades. And you would think that because I've been doing it a long time, I'm not bad at it by any means, that I'd be doing it all the time. I actually don't read for myself a huge amount. I read for myself when I feel uncertain, when I get the instinct that um, pressures are leading me potentially astray, that I'm not sure something will align with my values or help me reach a goal. And then I will pull cards, but I don't just do it for regular decisions because it can cause paralysis. That doesn't mean I don't listen. That's the other thing is read once, take the advice, move on. And if I know I'm going to do a thing, whether or not the cards are crap, then I'm just not going to read the cards because there's no point in knowing. And I actually have a funny little story about this where I was sort of exploring social media a little bit, which I always probably put my toes into, and then I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I want people to know what I do, right? Because I think what I do is helpful, but also I don't want to do too much of it, right? Like, so I was exploring a little bit and I got a lot of sort of like feedback that was suggesting that I should do a particular offering, like a particular course. And I felt uncomfortable. And I actually went to one of my primary like deities, right? And I said, I invoked and I said, I want a clear message on whether I should do this or not. And I threw 3 cards down, and it was like the Hermit, the Tower, the Ten of Swords. So that's not just no, that's like hell to the no. That's like all the no there is.
That is the most no.
That is the most no. I literally had, and here's the thing, I literally had like a marketing page up and I had some content ready to roll to say, I'm going to teach this little course. And then I was like, I am not. Because if I don't listen to that, then when I bother to do it, then I'm in real trouble.
Yeah. And that was also a way of listening to your intuition and having that be a part of the process that then swung you into, well, I will talk to the spirits that I have those relationships with, and then I will go to the divination, and then I will also follow through with the actions based on that. So it's a full spectrum of the things. And also not having the lock-in of saying, oh, but I put all this effort into it, and then going ahead with it, even if it had all of those different stages of no. But you would not have done that. So yes.
Right. And certainly I asked for a clear message and I got one. There was nothing wibbly wobbly about none of that sort of vaguely Taro sort of, there might be a good lesson for you in this. No, it was clearly not something I should be doing. And I felt the reason I asked was that I just kept being somewhat concerned about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that if, like you said, if the divination is part of a larger whole of living your life, doing risk management, all of that, then it becomes really beneficial. And it's harder for it to spiral into anxiety because it's part of all the things that you're working on.
Yes. So this is a time when we were talking about social media, and a lot of those forces of not just social media. I don't want to pick on just social media. There's
so easy, but yeah.
Easy, but no. But there are a lot of forces that are causing people to feel, I don't want to say paranoid, but that the world is challenging at the moment, and people feel a lot of emotions around that, the fear that is being brought up, and in many cases it is being done intentionally. Let's be clear, there's manipulation involved on a number of different fronts for that. How do you think about helping people address that, other than just saying, well, you should go off of social media or other such things? How do you think about helping people manage the fear that is sort of just engendered in culture around us these days?
This is such a valuable question, because I think that we're not even sometimes aware of how much sort of like harmful narrative terror is out there for us right now. And so we're like swimming in it, right? It can be really hard. And yes, let's all go to the woods and live in peace with the animals. Yeah, I get it. We all live in the world. I have a business to run, right? We have to do these things. I think that, I think that again, engaging with how you're feeling and why you're feeling that way, and then doing magic around that, is empowering and reduces fear. So, so you talked about like my early book, Risky Business. So I've been obsessed with this topic since for like a decade now, because there was like a book, and there was like a booklet like sold online, and then a revamped one, and then there was the course, and then there was the expanded course, which is like 12 weeks of lessons. And now there's this group consulting offering. And at a certain point, and it's always called Risky Business because I'm a Gen Xer, and it was funny because it was a movie that probably young people don't even remember, and so they don't get the joke. But I've stopped that. The consulting offering is called Sovereignty. It's not about risk. I mean, it is risk management, but it's about sovereignty. The idea is that we can incubate and gestate a sense of empowerment and sovereignty in our lives. Yes, through these techniques, but it's not about being scared. It's about not being scared. And I think we started this conversation with me joking about how crazy the risk narrative is out there. It's all very fear oriented and really terrifying. And you're at the site going, all I wanted to know was about collecting rainwater. Stop freaking me out. You know, and I know you two like live in the country and like care about, you know, having a garden and all of that. I don't want to be terrified while learning about perennial vegetables. It
Yes.
just doesn't seem helpful.
It doesn't really help you learn the Latin names of the plants. The question then is, you mentioned sovereignty, and I was actually going to ask you to define two words, and this leads beautifully into it, which was, how then do you think about the definition of the word sovereignty, and how do you think of the definition of the word courage? Because I feel like courage is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes it's positive, and I feel like sometimes it's also misapplied. And I think sovereignty is, by the way, one of my favorite words. And so I would love, your thoughts on the definitions of those words, if you wouldn't mind.
To me, courage is, interestingly, it's not about not being afraid. It's about when you're afraid and you do the right thing anyway. The right thing here being the thing that's aligned with your values and your kind of heart desires, right? Not just I do what I want, right? Because we all like live in a society together. But that when you're afraid, but you do the right thing anyway, that's courage. And I actually, it's really funny to come on here and be like, I do this risk stuff. It makes you less afraid. Yeah, I started doing that stuff because I needed to be less afraid, because I tend to be an anxious person. That is my sort of nature, to be somewhat of an anxious person. So to be anxious, to be scared, and to do the thing anyway, I think that's how we do courage. Now, in terms of sovereignty, which again is one of my favorite words, definitionally, it's like the king or the queen, right? Like the person in charge. And sometimes it feels like we're not in charge of anything. We're not the king or the queen, we're just the peons. But no, we are sovereign. We're just sovereign over our own tiny sphere, ourselves. We're sovereign together as a family. We're sovereign together as a community. We're in charge of ourselves. And when you realize that you're sovereign, and that truthfully, you're absolutely free to do anything as long as you're willing to take whatever consequences. You might not do anything. It's just, but that's how to approach it, right? And I say this all the time, each of us could get up, walk out the front door, throw our phone and our wallets in the gutters and walk free into the wilderness. And I'd be dead in 3 days. But I'm still free to do that, right? I'm free to do all kinds of amazing and beautiful and terrible things. And when we know that and we choose the right things, that's courage, despite the fact that we're afraid or the consequences might be bad. There might be a risk. And when we take control of the things that frighten us and we do the magic and the work to make things better for ourselves and our families and our communities, that's sovereignty.
Beautifully spoken. And I think that also ties into one of the questions I wanted to ask you. We're coming towards closer to the end of our time, but is there any way in particular that you have, from the work that you've done over the years with people, that you have noticed patterns of how people give their power away, either because the culture is encouraging them to do that, or they feel forced into doing that, or they're not even aware that it's happened? But what are some of the ways that you feel people have abdicated some of that sovereignty and they may not be aware of it?
I think that when people do it in ways that they're not aware of, that's much more problematic. Because I mean, if you think about a marriage, for example, because we're both married, a marriage is somewhat of an exchange of power, right? Like you give each other part of your power, and then you're stronger together as a team in a good marriage. That is a power exchange that is beneficial and networked and makes everybody. So you're giving some away, but you're getting something back. I think that sometimes we give our power to entities, structures of various kinds, whether that's family structures that aren't great, or religious structures, or social or narrative kinds of things, and we're not getting anything back. And so there's a depletion effect. There's some really insidious ways that our culture particularly wants us to be disempowered. And a lot of them are leveraged through the mechanism of capitalism, right? The big money thing, in that there's this idea that by giving money to things, like, to buy things, will somehow give you your power back. But that's not how that works. And so we have this idea that people will give away their power. And this doesn't mean like we all quit our jobs and become freegans, or again, live in the woods for a day and a half. It's just that when you are empowered in the world, then you're saying, yeah, I'll do this thing for you and you'll give me money and I'll pay my rent, but I'm making the choices and I'm empowered.
As you mentioned, I think that exchange of power, this discussion around power and sovereignty and courage, does not mean that we suddenly become islands, and that is not at all what we are saying. Because as you mentioned, just right there are wonderful and beautiful ways where that exchange is voluntary, and it's absolutely for the health of the flourishing of all the systems that we're in. So it's not to say that like sovereign means you stake your claim and give nothing back. The exact opposite in many ways. But when it is unconscious, or it is done in a way that harms lots of parties involved, then that is not what we are aiming for. And then I would say that divination and a lot of these magic processes can be tools that help us become at least aware of where that is happening, so that we can address them. Because if we don't have the awareness, we got very little chance of making a different choice.
Yeah. And in fact, I had this ongoing discussion with our mutual friend, Brian Wilkinson. I was on the podcast with him and Zamboni recently, about sacred kingship and queenship. And it was primarily his spark of an idea. So I always want to credit him for it. And he was saying that the concept of sacred kingship in a non-gendered way, right? Just in a way of being sovereign, is actually currency, like literally the flow of things out and in. And if you think about kings, what do? They make money, right? That's one of the things they do. What about cities? They're on rivers, there's a current, there's trade. And then my thought on it was that sacred queenship, again, outside of cis het normative nonsense, is about connection. Sacred queenship is about alliances and negotiations and marriages and treaties. And so when you are embodying sovereignty for yourself, both that sort of archetype, because this is what we're talking about here, right? Archetypes, is sacred kingship and sacred queenship. You are moving energy in and out in currency and flow, and you are networking and connecting and creating these connections with others. And that makes you more sovereign. It helps them be more sovereign too.
Yes, and I think that illusion that it is a static thing is part of how they keep us actually blocked from understanding the true nature of sovereignty and being able to embody it. So that is a very, very important point. I completely agree. So can you just, for this arc that you have and this kind of container that you have beginning very soon, when this episode is out, it will be, starting in the near future. What can you tell people about what you are planning to offer with it and what you are aiming to sort of like grow out of this? How do you see this as like a flowering of some of these ideas?
So this, the sovereignty arc is, it's the first time I'm really running this container for specifically around this magical risk process. But I've done it in the past for other things, like for starting a venture or other work that people are doing together. And so I know the container model itself works really, really nicely. And so what I'm doing is it's 20 weeks. It's a small group. We meet weekly, and we go through kind of the steps of helping each other to deal with any issues or crises and then mitigate our risks, working together to brainstorm and workshop and learn the methodology and do divination traits and enchant for one another and do the kind of like power of 8 intentions for one another. And so, yeah, it's a 20-week long, it's pretty intensive kind of thing to do. But it's been it's like my favorite thing to do. Like I get to hang out with like a wonderful group of people, and we all get to work together to make our lives better. And I love it to death. And I'm launching a new one, like you said, in just a couple days. But I must say that I don't just open the doors and then 20 people show up. The idea is that you hop on a quick call with me, we chat, we see if it seems like a good fit. And then when I have the right group of folks, then we kick off. So I want to start around the solstice, which I know is kind of like now, and I want to run through around Hollows, right? Day of the Dead, All Souls, right? So it runs for about 20 weeks. And there's sort of 3 phases in it. The first of which is the kind of crisis issue stuff, and then just understanding your exposure to risk, your risk landscape, where you might be fragile. And then the next 2 phases are both like the mitigation and then the kind of the advanced working around being stronger in the face of chaos. And you come out of it feeling less frightened and more flexible and resilient against possible risk.
That is fantastic. It's really, really a lovely thing. And all of the things that you offer out there are wonderful. And many listeners are already familiar with some of that. So I'm sure people will be very excited to check that out. Before we close, I've been doing this thing where I feel like, is there anything that you want to leave people with? It could be something that you find yourself talking about a lot. It could be totally unrelated to any topic we have been covering in this conversation today. But is there any practice that you want to share with people, or just something you feel like, I just need to say this thing to people right now?
I definitely think that we're in a time where a lot of people are quite afraid, and I understand, right? There's a lot of scary stuff going on. It impacts people, their families. There's some rough times. I think my primary message is, though, that we have to find enchantment and joy wherever we can, as much as we can. Not only because that's what helps us get through these tough times, but also because it's a deeply subversive fuck you to the powers that be. They don't want us to be happy. They want us to be afraid and feeling lack and terrified and anxious. And so we have an obligation to fight back by being grateful and joyful and knowing that even though humans mess stuff up, the world is still out there and it's a beautiful, enchanted place.
I could not honestly have thought of a better way to close, and I am so appreciative for your time and for all the things that you share here on this show. And I'm sure we'll have many more excuses to have you back on and talk divination and planning and all the other awesome things that you and I like to geek out about all the time on. So, where do people find you? Can you just give us the details of where it is best to look for your stuff?
So I'm on circlethrice.com is my site, and there's a library of all my free resources and my courses and various offerings. You can also find me on Substack at Circle Thrice, so check me out there where kind of the long form writing lives. I have an Instagram, again, with the dipping my toes into the social media, also called Circle Thrice. I'm very uniform about this. But yeah, follow along because most of that writing is just ideas and thoughts around how to get through crazy times and do more great magic and just, live a more enchanted life.
Absolutely. Well, that is awesome. And everything will be in the show notes. So thank you so much, Ivy. And I can't wait till we talk again.
Yes, thank you. It's been a wonderful time.
Black moon above, stars overhead. Don't you dare